Today we're going to talk about the Thor Protection deck. I'm really excited, so let's get into it. Here is the deck. First, take all of the Thor hero cards. Get your 3 resources as usual: Genius, Energy, and Strength. You're going to get 1 copy of Downtime and 1 copy of Endurance, 1 copy of Nick Fury, Mockingbird, Avengers Mansion, and Helicarrier, 2 copies of Enhanced Reflexes. Next, we're going to go in and grab 2 copies of the Power of Protection, 1 Armored Vest, 3 Indomitables, 3 Preemptive Strikes, 3 Energy Barriers, 1 Luke Cage, and 1 Nova. The first thing I want to focus on is if you're going to take a lot of damage, if your hero is going to soak up a lot of damage, there's a couple things that you need to do to get this moving. First off, Thor has a 2 defense, so to get that up to a 3, this 1 copy of Armored Vest will give him a 3 defense. Anytime he's defending, doing a defense action, that's going to allow him to soak up a lot of damage. The second part of the equation is going to be maximizing his hit points, and I'll show you how to do that. To improve your survivability in Marvel Champions, increase your hero's hit points. It will allow you to survive much longer, and especially against really tough foes. Here is a quick way that you can maximize Thor. First off, he starts with 14 hit points, which is a pretty high amount of hit points for a character to start with. Next off, his helmet gives him additional 5. 1 copy of Endurance is placed into the deck to give him an additional 3 hit points. That's plus 8 hit points. On the 14 that he starts with, that leaves you with 22. 22 hit points with armor, that Armored Vest on, you can soak up a lot of damage. It's a ridiculous amount of damage that you can soak up with this character. The third thing that we're going to do is we're going to throw a copy of Downtime into the deck. Since he has 22 hit points, potentially maximum for this deck build, you want to be able to recover those hit points quickly. His recovery score is a 4. So if you just add this Downtime card as well, when he's recovering, he'll gain 6 back per turn, which is a fantastic way to power him up very quickly. So 1 turn you can rest him. The next turn he starts in his alter ego form, you can rest him again, so that'd be 12 hit points in 2 turns that he could get back, and that's an amazing amount. Here's a quick comment I want to make about overcoming Thor's deficiency for his hand size. He's going to start with just a smaller hand size, which means he's going to be drawing less cards per turn. So in order to get his deck really moving, try to mulligan and look for either Asgard or this 4 Asgard card. What you're going to be trying to do is get Asgard out as soon as possible to increase your hand size by 1. If you don't get Asgard, a second card that you can get is for Asgard. You can go through your deck and actually look and pull this card. So I highly recommend getting Asgard out as soon as possible, and that will help you keep your resources moving, and it will keep your hand size strong so you can do a lot of protective abilities. Next, we're going to talk about resource generation. I'm going to show you in the next clip some of the cards that you really need to use to get this deck to kind of move forward. But in order to do that, you need a lot of the energy resources. What's great about the Thor deck is that there's 2 copies of God of Thunder that come in the hero cards for Thor. And then also, too, if you add 2 copies of Enhanced Reflexes, you're going to have a lot of the energy resources to use during the game. Your deck is going to generate a lot of energy resources. But what do you use those for? First, use it on your Lightning Strike cards. You have 2 copies of that in your deck. And then you also have 1 copy of Nova in your deck. So use those energy resources that I just talked about to really power up these cards. To play Thor effectively, I really enjoy the sort of concept of a Retaliation style deck. So first and foremost, you have Energy Barrier, and then secondarily, you have Preemptive Strike. Both of these cards, which also, incidentally, have energy icons, and so does Indomitable, that you can use to power some of your other cards. These are used to do some counterattack actions and some absorption actions. So first and foremost, Energy Barrier, you can remove one of the tokens from this to soak up a point of damage and also do 1 damage back to the enemy. So that's sort of that counterattack / retaliate function, which is a lot of fun to play. And then Preemptive Strike, you can cancel those boost icons when the villain is attacking, and then you can deal some of that damage right back. So think of it this way: you have potentially 22 hit points on your character. You have a pretty decent amount of armor on, a 3 if you're wearing the protective vest. Now think about all of these other ways that you can do to mitigate damage. So you're going to be reducing the villain's attack by a couple points, a point here, maybe 1 or 2 points here for preemptive strike, and then you're going to be dealing that damage right back. So those 22 hit points are going to go a really, really long way, and you can soak up a lot of damage and do some damage back in return to the villain. So I highly recommend running these cards to keep up your defense and deal some damage back in return. Finally, Indomitable, if you do defend, you can ready your hero, and so your hero can actually act on the next turn instead of being exhausted. Thor really shines when you are engaging enemies. So on his card, don't forget that when he engages a minion, you can draw 2 cards. In addition to that, always have a copy of the Avengers Mansion in your deck. These 2 cards together will allow you to draw a significant number of cards into your hand to keep your resources and your play options available. As a note for a Thor deck, if you're doing this protection style deck, Thor in general doesn't have a very good way to mitigate the threats on the table, so to speak, and the schemes that keep advancing. So always be aware that he has a very limited number of ways that he can remove threats from the game. He does have 3 copies of Defenders of the Nine Realms. And where this really shines is that you can play this down, remove 3 threat, then draw an additional minion from the encounter deck, which then will trigger Thor's card drawing ability. So always keep that in mind when you're trying to mitigate threat. This deck is fairly difficult to play in solo mode, as is a lot of the Thor decks, simply because of that threat management. But I highly recommend playing this deck when you have a 2, 3, or even 4-player game and somebody else can deal with those threats and those schemes. Finally, don't forget, just because you're playing a protection deck, Thor still has the ability to really hurt the enemy, specifically with Hammer Throw. There are 3 copies of Hammer Throw in this deck as well. Remember that if you are soaking up minions and you're engaging minions, a great way to deal with those minions and hurt the villain at the same time is to use Hammer Throw. And remember that this is an overkill ability, so if you kill off a minion, all the excess damage then goes right through to the villain. So don't forget that. You're going to be engaging a lot of enemy minions, and that's a good thing. You're going to be drawing cards, and then you're going to be hammer throwing to deal with them. So this is a great combo. Definitely keep that in mind when you're playing this deck. To sum it up, if you like playing a hero that can soak up a ton of damage, this is the deck for you. It has a decent amount of offense, it has a decent amount of counterattacking, and it can keep the other players alive at the table that maybe are a little bit more squishy and they get brought down a lot quicker. Think of yourself as a true hero, almost this tank-like entity, the Thor tank. You can soak up a ton of damage and have fun while doing it. I want to thank you for spending your time with me today. Hopefully this deck gave you some of your own ideas for deck building, and hopefully you enjoy playing this deck. Thanks again for watching, and as always, have fun gaming.